So in case anyone wasn't aware, there were some pretty high-profile Democratic Party primary elections last night in the United States. I'm specifically talking about the Wisconsin gubernatorial election, which in this case was between Francesca Hong and David Crowley. David Crowley was a moderate candidate, and Francesca Hong was for the Democratic Socialists of America, or was at least the DSA-endorsed candidate. And throughout the entirety of the run-up to the election, Francesca Hong was leading in the polls, roughly around about 40%. In fact, the main opponent, David Crowley, once stepped out after one of the other moderate candidates seemed to be on the ascendancy, only for that moderate candidate, Sarah Rodriguez, to quit her campaign for financial reasons, and for David Crowley to re-enter the race 10 days after having quit the first time. What this meant was, after the rest of the field had cleared out, it ended up being a straight shoot between Hong and Crowley. Having Hong led the entire time, David Crowley narrowly eked out a win when the primary results were announced last night by around half a percentage point. So it was incredibly close, both candidates on around about 40% of the vote, with Crowley mostly winning in the more kind of affluent areas of Milwaukee, and then the university towns and then the youth vote heavily breaking for Hong in places like Madison, places like Eau Claire, and indeed places like Oshkosh as well. So that's what we've seen in terms of these results. And it's a pretty heavy loss for the DSA, not in terms of the vote share, because it was an incredibly close election, but in terms of the expectations running into this election. Most people expected that Francesca Hong would be the victor, given how much of a polling lead that she had over the broadly spread field amongst the moderate candidates. And as a socialist and progressive channel, I want to talk about where the left goes from here. Now, it's worth pointing out, just as in every election, this is but one battle in the larger fight for socialism. The idea that this one electoral loss means the end of the DSA campaign, the end of the Democratic Party, Tea Party, the end of the socialist movement, or it's been stopped in its tracks, is nonsense. The likewise would be said in terms of Michigan, for example, the Israeli lobby, its influence had gone because Haley Stevens lost, that the progressive wing were fundamentally on the ascendancy. That's not true either. They were both close results, and neither of them show any kind of large capitulation for one side to the other. It is, again, one battle in many battles to be fought in the fight for socialism. In the words of Tony Benn, there is no final victory. There are only the same battles being fought again and again and again. That is the reality of the fight towards socialism, and to maintain the socialist principles of the social democratic or progressive reforms that socialists fight for every day. So people shouldn't be disheartened by this narrow loss, just in the same way that they shouldn't be counting their chickens because Abdul El Sayed won in Michigan, or because Darius Avila Chevalier won in the New York congressional seat, and indeed when Zohran Mamdani won in New York City. These are many fights, and we cannot count eggs before they've hatched, either in the positive or negative direction. One thing that people are asking about is, how were the polls so wrong? Well, the reality is that the polls weren't that wrong. When you look at the broader range of the polls, most of them had Francesca Hong with around about 40% of the, give or take, the margin of error. The problem is that in the run-up to the election, when the polls were being done, the moderate field was split. It was split between multiple different candidates, including Sarah Rodriguez and Mandela Barnes, alongside David Crowley. Hence why people were quitting, people were re-entering the race, because people didn't really know who the main moderate challenger would be for Francesca Hong, who had led in the primary polling all the way up until the day of the general election. And the reason for this is that voters are very good at self-sorting, especially when it became clear in the run-up to the election day that David Crowley would be that main challenger. And for people who were concerned with either beating the DSA for ideological reasons or trying to vote for what they thought was going to be the best candidate to beat the Republicans in the main general election, there was always going to be a level to which the vote would consolidate around David Crowley on the more right-wing or moderate side of the electorate. So the idea that the polls were massively off, I don't actually buy that for 1 second. Like, it's different than in Michigan, where the polls showed Abdul El Sayed with quite a large margin of victory in the run-up to the election, but when it's an open primary, and in Michigan, the Republican primary wasn't particularly competitive, a lot of Republican voters stayed home from their primary, and because it's an open primary, they went to the Democratic Party primary and voted Haley Stevens, potentially for pro-Israel reasons. Who knows, you don't really ask these things, but there was reporting showing that Republican voters were entering the Democratic Party primary on the open primary election day because they wanted to make sure that someone like Abdul El Sayed didn't make it onto the ballot. Shows you how scared the Republicans are of progressives. But regardless, when it comes to this poll, even though it was an open primary, the Republican primary was competitive. So it shows it probably was more likely to do with the Democratic Party voter base more favouring a moderate candidate, or not potentially being bought into Francesca Hong because of some campaign failings that we'll go into in a second. The main campaign failing, I think, when it comes to Francesca Hong was a massive lack of spending on TV ads. She didn't spend a penny on TV ads. It was all on streaming services, marketed at a younger audience. Now, whilst I understand that a lot of these adverts are really important on streaming services to drive voter turnout, especially amongst young people who generally have a lower level of turnout than the older generations. You can't rely on those voters alone. You do have to try and motivate the boomer electorate. Again, they are very high propensity, and they're really obsessed with making sure that they get the candidates that they want elected. Young people constantly need hammering. You need to doorstep them, you need to hit them with adverts on streaming services that they're going to see because they don't watch regular terrestrial television. You can't just leave one whole set of advertising and one whole set of voter outreach on the table and not engaging with it and forgetting a whole sector of the electorate. That was a massive failing, and whilst of course I understand she didn't have that much cash on hand, the idea she would have been able to afford all of these TV adverts probably is understandable, right? That she wouldn't have been able to afford them. But if we want DSA candidates to win, if we want socialism to be successful in the United States of America, if we want to be able to beat the establishment Democrats who outspend us continually, look like they outspend Abdul El-Sayed in the Michigan Senate primary by a factor of 10 to 1, we're going to have to put our money where our mouth is. Act Blue already get loads of donations for moderate Democrats because they believe in the project of defeating the Republicans. But if we want to offer positive, real-world policy-based solutions, we have to make sure people know about what our policies are. And that means buying adverts everywhere where we can reach voters, not just in one sector of the electorate that we're trying to mobilize. That means trying to reach out to boomers, find out what they care about, find out their particular policy issues, and offer our socialist solutions as a reason to vote for us. And that means running TV adverts that boomers are going to see. Another big campaign failure was the fact that there was no endorsement from really large Democratic Party progressive figures such as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These people are big players, and their endorsements have won time and time and time again. I understand that these people really don't have any interest in making that many endorsements in terms of places outside of their locale, or indeed in statewide rather than national elections that they're not party to, but this is an important movement to be able to win as much as we can. And because both of them claim that they are democratic socialists, they should be invested in making sure that people like the DSA don't get beaten in these elections because it can change the narrative. I understand that whilst we look in terms of the round, it's not a huge defeat. And in fact, if you told anybody in a swing state like Wisconsin, Francesca Hong and the DSA would be doing as well as they did, they wouldn't have believed you 6 months ago. The reality, of course, is there was an expectation management problem going into the election where people thought that Hong would win. Therefore, it's seen as a big defeat, even though it's a pretty substantial success even in a loss in this state because it was so close, right? That's an important thing. And those 3,000, 4,000 votes could have been shifted by a proper Bernie or AOC endorsement, which would have continued the momentum of the DSA, which they claim to want to support, much, much further than it has been already. And we wouldn't be having this discussion about trying to expectation manage when they could have just won this election if there was a proper endorsement. Again, I understand why they strategically don't do these kind of endorsements, because if it goes wrong, it can reflect badly on them. But these are difficult times, and we need to win these elections now whilst the iron is hot and whilst the Republicans are so weak. If we start winning primary elections and losing general elections at a later point when the Republicans are stronger, that could undermine our movement more broadly too. So now is the time to strike while the iron is hot and get these large-scale endorsements, just like they did of Penny Flanagan in Minnesota, because she was in a national election, essentially, because that's what the Senate manages. So they were happy to endorse Penny Flanagan. Fantastic that she won, and she beat AIPAC, and she won by a huge margin over Angie Craig, purely on grounds of her comments on places like ICE and her position on a bunch of other progressive issues. That's important, but of course, every single election will be taken in its microcosm. Of course, the corporate media, despite it being unfair, they're going to paint small victories for Abdul El-Sayed as some kind of flash in the pan, and small victories against Francesca Hong as the thorn in the side that capitulates the whole progressive movement. I know it's bollocks, you know it's bollocks, but at the end of the day, that's the corporate media's prerogative, is to undermine progressivism and to boost moderate wing of the Democratic Party. When it comes to Francesca Hong's personal missteps, the biggest one that lots of people are talking about are these comments around Thanksgiving. Now, this one's going to piss off a lot of people, but I think that it stands to reason that winning is what is important here. Losing gallantly and losing whilst feeling that you're magnanimous doesn't win you shit in politics. And if you had asked a question about Thanksgiving, which you know Americans have a lot of cultural love for, undermining that by refusing to answer the question no when you're asked, would you cancel Thanksgiving, is immediately going to put people off. And again, not just in the primary, but potentially in the general if she'd won as well. That would have been a real big thorn in her side. That she couldn't just say, no, I don't want to cancel Thanksgiving. Like, you can just say no. It wasn't going to be in her remit as Wisconsin governor. It wasn't going to be part of her policy platform. It was nothing other than a gotcha question from somebody who wants to see her fail, giving her a space with which to broadcast that failure, and she fell into the trap incredibly easy. You can just say no. Just say no. It's really, really easy to do so. No one is going to deny you entry to the gates of heaven because you lied once during a questioning round in a hostile corporate media environment for a gubernatorial primary in Wisconsin. That's not happening. You can just lie. Even if you personally believe that there are loads of problematic elements to Thanksgiving, like, that's not your remit when you're going to get elected. When Trump and Starmer lied, and you know what, something is to be said about how good they were at lying and then winning off of the back of those lies. They lied about their policy prescriptions and their role in government. They would be able to have those lies be uncovered during their time in office, which they have done. Unless the Francesca Hong policy platform was going to include cancelling Thanksgiving as the governor of Wisconsin, you can just lie. It's totally fine to just lie and say no, that you don't want to cancel it. These should be really, really easy questions to get right. If you're asked about whether you want to defund the police, just talk about the social programs that you want to put into place that reduce crime, right? Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. You don't have to talk about reduced police budgets, but if you need to do it to be able to implement those social programs, you don't have to tell anybody that you're going to do that and get yourself negative coverage before the election. Again, no one's going to deny you entry into heaven because you were slightly less than forthcoming about your plans for police budgetary reductions to be able to fund social programs to fix crime from source rather than deal with it after it's happened. Most people in America believe that social programs are better at reducing crime than tough on crime policies. You just need to make sure that you're doing better branding than, quote, defund the police, which already has negative connotations. Talk about your social programs. Talk about redistributing those kind of budgetary allocations towards things that prevent crime. You can do that without using phraseology like defund the police. It's not a difficult line to cross, and it will help you win elections. I think the last point that I'll make is that one thing that really does matter for these Democratic Party primary elections is electability. And I know you'll be watching this and going, Helena, you know electability is a dogshit term. You know that no one actually believes that right-wing Democrats are more electable than Democratic Socialists. The reality shows that Democratic Socialists win loads of elections all the time. The idea that they can't sell their votes to the electorate when their policies are popular is nonsense. They are perfectly electable. And I totally agree. Those things are all true. The problem, of course, is it's about perception in these primary elections. It's not how electable you are in the general, it's how you are perceived in terms of your electability to the people who are voting in that primary election. Of course, this dovetails into what I was saying before about making your branding toxic in terms of answers to gotcha questions, right? These are all part and parcel of making yourself seem electable. If you don't have these kind of gaffes, you're going to be able to be viewed as more electable come the general election and win more primary voters on those metrics. And on top of this, you've got to sell your policy prescriptions, not just on the grounds that they are good for the public, but to these people who are desperately terrified of Trumpism. They hate ICE, they hate Trump, they viscerally despise the Republican Party, and their anger with the Democrats is they're not doing enough to beat him. If you're going to frame your policies, it's not good enough just to talk about their positive utility. You have to talk about it in how they're going to be good at beating Republicans, and then people will vote for you. Will that be a way in which that you can win over even moderate voters? I think that that's true. Again, you look at other successes. You look at Mamdani. Mamdani was an incredibly effective communicator in terms of how his affordability agenda would beat Trump. Remember when Mamdani said in his victory speech that the best way to take power away from a despot is to eliminate the conditions that gave rise to them?
And if there is any way to terrify a despot, it is by dismantling the very conditions that allowed him to accumulate power. This is not only how we stop Trump, it's how we stop the next one.
That's the way that you beat Trumpism. Trump won off the wave of the intervailing economic winds, the economic headwinds the Democratic Party was governing into during the post-COVID era and the inflationary crisis that followed. He was winning on economic grounds, on the affordability problem. Mamdani showed that by focusing on these problems, solving issues that the public believes in, because voters don't really vote on ideology, they vote on whether or not they think that politicians are providing solutions to the issues that they find important to them. By approaching those issues with democratic socialist policies that people are polled to continually like, you can sell your message of electability. We can beat Trump because we are the ones who have the solutions to the problems that Trump won by. We are the ones who can solve affordability through social programs, through decommodification, through public investment and public works, through free bus initiatives like Mamdani did in New York City, through things like Medicare for all. Of course, in terms of Francesca Hong, this was Wisconsin gubernatorial primary. Medicare for all isn't on the ballot, but social programs, they're certainly on the ballot. Tax changes and taxing the wealthy, they're certainly on the ballot. In terms of protecting communities from the negative externalities of Trumpism, these are all things that you can campaign on as your way of beating Trump. That's a really important framing that the DSA have to engender in primaries moving forward. It's not just about having better policies than your opponent. It's not just about being better candidates than your opponent. It's about being better at beating the Republicans than your opponent. Because I firmly think that David Crowley would be worse at beating the Republicans than Francesca Hong. He was pro-data center when the majority of people in Wisconsin very, very negatively polarized towards them. Francesca Hong should be popular broadly statewide in her data center moratorium policy and her taxing the wealthy policies, which also polls well. But again, moderate voters were put off from her because of comments that she'd made in the past, because of the framing of the DSA being dangerous communists, despite the fact they said that about Joe Biden, whilst Biden is a centrist anyway. But Francesca Hong, despite being perfectly good at marketing a data center moratorium to Democrats, she couldn't convince the primary electorate that that was a positive policy to beat Republicans in the general. And that's where this electability argument, or this perception of electability, is important at selling our project, the project of socialism, to the Democratic Party primary base. Not just in terms of its positive utility, but in how it can not just beat Trump, but stop future Trumps from coming down the line, just as Mamdani said all of those months ago. Again, this is just one loss in the road to socialism. There will be many more battles to fight, many more victories and many more losses. We cannot be disheartened by this one particular loss, especially given how small that loss was. Less than a percentage point in terms of the raw vote share. Question is, how do we take the lessons from how we lost this time and make sure that we can use those lessons to win in future and to keep winning and to shape the Democratic Party so it's in favor of working people rather than corporations, in favor of peace rather than of war and genocide, in favor of politics of hope rather than the politics of moderation. There is a world to win. There can be plenty of victories in the future. We just got to make sure we fight for it.